I think we're ready to get started. So let's get going. Hello, everybody out there who has joined us today. We're glad to have you and really looking forward to a terrific program this afternoon. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to make a few introductions before really jumping in and turning over the mic essentially to each of our four terrific experts that we have with us today. First, I'll just introduce myself and Christina Terosher, our AAMG president. I am Natalie Marsh. I'm the secretary and the Midwest representative for AAMG and the conference co-chair. And looking forward to introducing each of our four guests today before we open up to Q&A. Please use the Q&A function. We will collect questions at the end of the presentations. We'll select questions, I should say, from the Q&A, not from the chat. So be mindful of that. Each of our presenters are going to make short presentations before we spend the majority of our time on Q&A. And you can type a question into Q&A at any time. We'll be monitoring throughout. So let me start with some quick introductions to each of our guests. And I'm really grateful that all four of you are here with us today and have participated in the planning and the many conversations that took place in the lead up to this program. Martin Gammon is the founder of Pergamon Art Group, which advises museums and private clients on collection management issues. And he was formerly Director of Business Development and Museum Services for Bonham's Auctioneers, where he was also a specialist in the field of rare books and manuscripts. Martin is also the author of an excellent book on deaccessioning that we highly recommend. And he will share a number of ideas for making use of the provisions offered through the CARES Act. John Sare is also with us today. John is a partner in the tax-exempt organizations practice and the trusts and estates group of Patterson, Belknap, Webb, and Tyler, LLP. Mr. Sare has extensive experience in the representation of museums, colleges, private foundations, and other types of exempt organizations. This work includes advising charities on the issues and options they face with respect to their endowment funds and other types of restricted gifts. He'll share a number of ideas for charitable remainder trusts and charitable gift annuities today. And Lampe joins us. She is the executive director of the Museum Trustee Association. She has extensive experience as a museum director, as well as service as a trustee in numerous organizations, giving her a really comprehensive understanding of the trustee, director, museum relationship. She has curatorial experience in several museums, and her 13 years as director, executive director and chief curator at the DeMuth Foundation, where she transformed it from a small organization into a strong collecting, exhibiting, and operational institution, really aid her in recognizing our special needs as museum leaders in academia. She'll provide a sense of how museum leaders and trustees around the country are responding to our current crises, particularly working with trustees. Since joining CCS in 2008, Miriam Droller has partnered with institutions across all sectors, including higher education, healthcare, advocacy, arts, and culture, bringing to bear nearly 2 decades of professional experience in strategic planning, in major gifts fundraising, development department structure and operations, and campaign management for leading nonprofit organizations. So just a reminder, we're going to be turning after our 5 to 8 minute presentations from each of our speakers to a Q&A. So those of us tuning in, please type your questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to turn it over now. We're going to start with Miriam.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I'm going to have a couple of slides pop up in a minute. CCS works with about 500 organizations each year across the nonprofit sector to advance fundraising goals. And we do quite a bit of work in both the cultural sector as well as higher education. This has been a particularly difficult time for both arts organizations whose very mission is to convene communities and institutions of higher education who've had to make difficult and complex decisions about reopening, and certainly even more so for all of you who sit at the intersection of both sectors. I think it's really important to acknowledge first that depending on where you are in the country, there might be stark differences about the current accessibility of your programs. But regardless, we realize that the demands on philanthropy are increasing for all of you exponentially. So just to start us off today, I'd like to offer a couple of our thoughts on the landscape and some guiding principles about how you might think about activity in the coming months. I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, but I'm happy to make the slides available after the session. Back in May, we launched a philanthropic climate survey to help the sector understand the impact of COVID on fundraising. And we conducted additional surveys in June and September with more than 1,000 respondents for each survey. A few general observations. First, very positively, we continue to see extraordinary acts of generosity, even though we initially saw organizations reluctant to appeal for funds. The organizations who continue to engage with donors are getting some very good results in this latter half of the year and some very nice surprises. We want to acknowledge too that the crisis has had an uneven impact on organizations, even within the same sector with similar demographics. Depending on their own economics, their operating models, their staffing structures, endowments, and reserves, this moment has really hit organizations differently. We've also seen a parallel unevenness on the economic fortunes and psychology of donors too. But we are finding that donors and stakeholders are willing and available to talk. They care about how the crisis is impacting the organizations they care about, and they're responding with both their time and their resources. We also know that institutional leaders at this time are thinking about their development operations and how they're deploying resources for both short-term and longer-term, especially as other revenue sources, especially tuition revenue for universities, continue to be uncertain. So there is a very real reality that layoffs and furloughs among fundraising staff have grown more common across the board since May. As you can see from these charts, while organizations continue to anticipate declines in fundraising over the course of 2020, we have seen some increasing optimism over the course of these surveys, and the outlook is improving heading into year end. There are some differences across sectors, of course, and for both the arts and higher education, our service model has been upended, and we've really been forced to rethink how we maintain best practices in fundraising while reacting to the constraints of social distancing. The sector has a lot to be proud of in how it's risen to the challenge of this moment. By and large, there's been a full-scale pivot to virtual methods of engagement, videos and calls, events including galas and small cultivation events. 43% of respondents have conducted virtual major gift solicitations during this pandemic, most of them successfully. And organizations have really leveraged their board members and other volunteer leaders in ways they haven't before to great success, especially in terms of donor stewardship. Organizations are really hitting all channels with large portions of respondents engaging in very personal methods, making more direct appeal, especially to major donors, and really across all segments of the donor base. And we have also seen an increase in planned giving conversations, which I know John is going to touch on in a little bit. Two themes that have been really consistent in our analysis have been the importance of staying the course and focusing now more than ever on increasing donor engagement and building relationships. Individuals remain the primary source of support for nonprofits, the majority coming from board members, from major donors, and other current donors. A strong case for support remains at the forefront, reaffirming your mission and impact to those who are closest to you. And as far as campaigns, very few organizations have canceled or postponed campaigns during this time. The majority are continuing them, though a significant number have modified plans in terms of timeline, financial goals, or priorities to reflect the current environment. And we're pleased to see that from our most recent survey, 5% of respondents indicated that they were kicking off new campaigns. So that gives us a bit of optimism as we look forward. I wanted to share with you a couple of principles, timeless principles in fundraising. CCS has extensive experience over the past 70 years during times of crisis, economic stress, and in the wake of natural disasters. And while certainly these current times present a host of special challenges, there's a lot that we can learn from previous downturns and emergency situations to really guide us in this moment. The most important lessons that we emphasize include the importance of staying connected and engaged with your constituents, adjusting your fundraising strategies as needed and appropriate, but not an all-out cancellation of fundraising plans. Strong leadership, resilience, and a strong plan have helped organizations persevere through challenging times in the past. And this moment really provides the opportunity for you to reaffirm your mission and deepen the relationships you have with your donors and with your community. Your donors have invested their time and their resources because of their love of the institution. And your organization represents their passions. In many cases, it's their escape from their stressors of everyday life. And you play a vital role in the community, both within the university, but also more broadly. So where do we go from here? I know there's a lot of detail on this slide, but I think for most of us, it's safe to say that we're past this immediate crisis response phase. And most of you are really in this recalibration phase, if not into your reemergence already, but we all need to continue to look forward. What do our organizations look like on the other side? We certainly know that philanthropy is resilient, but we know that we're going to have to continue to adapt. So how do we think about redefining the realization of our mission? And what are the resources that we're going to need to reemerge? And the activities that we're putting into place in the next 3 months, 6 months, year that are really going to get us there. Certainly a compelling case for support, strong leadership, including leveraging our volunteers, loyal prospective donors, and a very disciplined approach. Again, I'm happy to make these slides available. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Martin.
Thank you, Miriam. That's very interesting, and looking forward to diving deeper into those slides and the information in the background. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today, and thank you so much for inviting me. I, as was mentioned, have been advising museums large and small in various elements of collection management, both at an auction house and as an independent advisor. And what I wanted to focus on today was as a specific project we've developed this year based on some experiences we've had in the past with museums seeking to develop an opportunity to help donors for their institution who have artworks that have had substantial appreciation and would like to make a contribution to the operational other fundraising needs of the institution, but that the current climate in the traditional format, given certain IRS regulations, make it less appealing. And so as a background, what we're basically trying to promote is what's called the Art Pledge Program. And this is an opportunity, it's kind of a new charitable vehicle that we're pioneering with some auction houses to create a formula where individuals can donate or consign a work with substantial appreciation, and the proceeds of sale after their capital gains liability has been returned to them are then gifted to their chosen institution as a cash donation, as opposed to a transfer of title of that artwork to the museum itself. The idea here is something that's been developed by our firm over a few years, but was accelerated by the new regulations in the CARES Act that was passed earlier this year in the aftermath of the pandemic. And one of the chief elements of that act that makes this particular program and others potentially quite attractive is that the IRS will now allow individuals to increase the adjustment or deduction of their adjusted gross income for cash donations from 60% to 100% potentially of their income. And so this much wider and deeper opportunity to take estate planning around cash donations makes it a very attractive opportunity for museums and other charitable institutions to explore that opportunity with their donors. However, of course, it needs to be cash and not artwork. And of course, many of your donors may have limitations in their ability to raise funds, liquid funds in that manner, but may in fact have artwork or other collectibles that have appreciated that they would potentially want to contribute for that cause and need a vehicle to do so. So the idea behind the Art Pledge program is a special auction vehicle, and we've partnered with a number of auction houses, Phillips and Sotheby's, and possibly some other specialty firms, to create a special sales platform or section of an auction where there's essentially two legal structures, but very briefly. The consignment agreement is not modified so that the terms and conditions of the pledge are made explicit in the catalog and in the advertising, so people are aware that the net proceeds will go to support this institution. And there's a modified pledge agreement between the donor and the institution that those funds will be forwarded to them once their capital gains liability has been satisfied. The issue here, and just a brief background, is I had done some charity auctions in the past for some institutions, including the Berkeley Art Museum, where tremendously valuable works were offered at the charity auction, but the only participants were the individuals who showed up at the gala that night. And there were potentially much broader interests from a larger audience that was being missed in terms of trying to enhance the possible outcomes for that institution. We subsequently did an auction for SF MoMA, where we did a fully vetted professional catalog with this additional charitable component to it. And what we found was that works offered in that format would often significantly exceed what you would expect they would make in just a traditional auction. So for example, we had a Chuck Close photograph that made $28,000 in this auction with a charitable purpose, when other examples of that particular photograph were making about $10,000 in normal sales. So the principle behind the Art Pledge program is to take advantage of this enhancement effect and the fact that you can bring additional audiences to a sale that has a charitable purpose, so that the usual suspects who would be collecting objects of this nature are competing against supporters of the museum, supporters of the institution, as individuals who want to support the philanthropic outcome. The net effect of the Art Pledge program then is that you have great benefits for the donor. They have the opportunity potentially, if it's completed this year, to have as much as 100% reduction in their adjusted gross income. They also can take advantage of estate planning on the basis of that advantage, but they can also make a substantial contribution other than cash to their favorite institution this year. The alternatives, as I've mentioned, which involve either gifting a work and transferring the title for a charity auction, is limited in that the IRS will only accept the cost basis for the donor in such an instance, and that can be fairly limiting for their estate planning benefits. And then, of course, if they had gifted the work directly to the museum, they encumber the various rules the IRS have that there needs to be a related use to the museum's purpose. They need to hold it for 3 years. There are a number of appraisals and other encumbrances. But the most important deficit, in my view, of that approach is that the museum essentially can't see the proceeds of the sale for 3 years if they're going to hold to the donor's full fair market value. This enhancement effect, however, of an Art Pledge program that brings potentially higher prices essentially mitigates the effect of the capital gains liability that they would have to pay, which is roughly 30% in most cases. So we believe it's a framework that can allow people to explore alternative ways of generating philanthropic giving in this time with assets that might otherwise have languished or not been considered as potentially viable to help institutions in the near term. It's not a panacea and it won't solve everyone's problems in itself, but there are quite a number of cases where someone might have a Grandma Moses painting in the attic they received from their parents and no longer expect their children to want. And it may not be appropriate for accession by the museum they support. And yet, if they were to offer it for sale in the format we offer, they would be able to satisfy their concomitant capital gains liability from the sale and gift the remainder of the cash donation to their museum this calendar year. Of course, the CARES Act will expire at the end of this year, and I think Anne, my colleague from the MTA, will address that further. But even in the subsequent years, next year and so forth, there is still an advantage to cash over artwork donation from these purposes. So we think it still has an attractive possibility, and it can become an additional arrow in your quiver when you're having development discussions with your donors. I have a white paper on it and can share it with anyone if they'd like to see more about it. But let me pass the conversation now over to Ann Lampe, my colleague at the MTA.
Thanks, Martin. And it really is such a great, wonderful, innovative idea that you came up with in response to this CARES Act to help people leverage their assets and get them out and get the money to our organizations that really need the support and the funding right now. And so it's a really wonderful, innovative program. And as Martin said, someone may have something their grandmother gave them up in the attic, or you may have a young board member who just received things from their parents that they're not so interested in. And this would be an ideal moment to pass those along back out into the public sphere and generate that needed donation for the organization. So really wonderfully innovative. And the CARES Act, just to repeat what Martin said, for cash gifts, it's very, very pro giving this year. And so on two levels. So for anyone who does a tax return this year, you can write off $300 of cash gifts to your above the line income, your gross income. So for your lower level donors, for your lower friends, maybe for some docents or other people that you have involved in your organization, people aren't really aware of that. So there's a $300 cash donation that comes off your gross income. And then if you happen to be a giver who is more philanthropic, or some of your larger givers, if they give over $24,000 a year, and that's the standard deduction for a couple, let's say, they can get 100% credit for their 100% write-off for their cash donation this year. So 2020 is a great year for people to give. And we like to encourage that at the Museum Trustee Association, because we want our trustees to give until it hurts, and we want to help them understand how to do it the best way that they can. So, so just to reiterate some of those CARES Act things that are really fantastic opportunities this year. Just to talk a little bit about advisory boards and working with your advisory board members, your trustees. I think, as in this unprecedented time of strain and unprecedented times of uprisings and different things happening in the country, communications is the most important thing that you can do with your trustees. And it's what's going to really bring them in the fold and keep them with you. And your advisory board members are some of your biggest stakeholders, and you want to make sure that those good standing relationships stay that way, and that they're in the loop on what's happening, and they know where you're going and what your thinking is. It's key to keeping them with you. And you want to make sure your stakeholders, your donors, your big advisors are with you as you're moving through these unprecedented times. And I would say, Miriam alluded to it, notes, and as she said, direct contact with those donors is important, but personal notes to advisory board members, personal notes to your larger donors, and then the more email or newsletter communications with other stakeholders and community members that you're bringing in is really important. And I would say in those communications, transparency is key. Message honestly about the challenges that you're facing. The whole world is feeling it, and we're all in this huge challenge together. And so, if your institution cut your budget by 50%, be honest about it, and tell people how much you've been cut. If you're not honest about that and you have to cut a lot of staff members, your docents will get upset. So be honest about where you are. I think that's important for everyone to know. And be honest about what you need. I mean, if your institution cut a major aspect of your operation that you really need to hold your collection in care, or get a digital virtual program out there, be honest about what you need and how people can contribute towards that need. I think that's an important aspect of communications as well. So I feel communications, not only with your advisory board, but with all of your stakeholders in your community, your outside community coming in, your campus community, and with your deans and so forth up the chain as well. Be really honest in your communications. Miriam also said that early on in the pandemic, people were a little afraid to ask for money, I heard people were very afraid to talk to donors. Don't be afraid. Engage with them, talk to them. They are there to help you. They have entrusted their time and treasure and talents with you, and now more than ever they want to help you. So just engage them in conversation, find out where they are and what they're doing, and they'll talk and find ways to respond. And I think this year is unique in that there are a lot of incentives for people to help and to give charitably if they can. And so you just need to get those conversations going and be top of mind to them, and they will help. So I always say, ask, ask, ask. Don't be afraid this year, because we're coming into the end of the year when people are thinking about things as well. Another thing is, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Where, with your advisory board members, you've managed through a lot of this crisis. We don't know how much longer it's going to go on. But as Miriam said, a lot of you are in times where you've survived the crisis period, and you can start to think about either reopening your museum, or you've reopened your museum, and the future. And you need to use this time to really think about it and proactively come together and set goals for the future, and really engage your advisory board in those goals. One of the things that obviously we're seeing most happen a lot is DEI goals for advisory boards and for the boards themselves. Is something that people have sort of intermittently dealt with along the way. Now people are really, grappling with this and really digging in on DEI. And I think it's a great moment to focus on that. It's also, it was very early on in the pandemic, nonprofit organizations that were dealing with DEI issues and larger issues in that social realm, they got so much funding, they don't know what to do with it. So if someone is feeling strongly about getting that kind of work started at your organization, at your advisory board, they can give to you to get that started, rather than giving to that national organization that is still, many of them are overfunded. And so that's a great way to connect and to move the organization forward in something that I think we all know and have known is needed, but kind of got put in the side burner because in years past, we were focused on building buildings and expanding collections and other things. And now is a good moment, since we aren't together in the same way, that DEI work can really move forward. So when I talk about DEI work, we do talk about 2042, our nation will become a nation of minorities. But interestingly enough, and people are always surprised by this, statistically, the group that will grow the most between now and 2042 is the Hispanic community, not the African-American community. So the Hispanic community will go from 18% to 25%, and the African-American community goes from 12% to 13%. So as you're looking around your communities, think about diversity in many different ways. And at MTA, we think about it not only as race and ethnicity, but gender, age, sexual orientation, occupation and skill set, and geography. And that's something else as educational institutions where you have a lot of alumni and you have people that are connected to you, but far away. With this new Zoom, everybody using Zoom and new technologies, you can hold your advisory board meetings in new and innovative ways. And that is another thing that has really helped a lot of institutions moving forward, staying connected with folks. So that's what I have. And now I'm going to pass off to John for our charitable trusts and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Anne, for that inspiring talk about what could lie ahead for institutions who are willing to make the kind of commitment that you're describing. I think it's really important right now. I'm going to continue talking along the lines of these tax points that we were hearing about a bit earlier from Martin, and try to go a few steps farther along the line of some tax opportunities here. I think anybody who's involved in fundraising inevitably has to deal with the reality of certain tax concepts, some of which can seem very abstract or confusing. And I'm hoping I can explain really three different techniques in kind of ascending level of likely popularity. That is, I'm going to start with the one that I think is available to the largest number of potential donors, and then go to the sort of up the pyramid to ones that are available to maybe a smaller number of donors, but to wealthier donors. And if I have time, I'll talk about one or two other topics as well. The first thing I want to emphasize is that the individual retirement account, or IRA, rollover potential is still there. This has been part of the law now for several years. It's now a permanent part of the law, and it allows anybody who has attained the age of 70 and a half years to roll over up to $100,000 from their IRA as a charitable gift. This is a very powerful tool for people who have money in their IRAs that they are not expecting to tap. I think it's an important thing to bring up with donors. It's $100,000 for an individual, but it can be $200,000 for a married couple, again, if they've both attained the age of 70 and a half. And the way the rollover works is the full $100,000 goes to your organization, and instead of being taken into the income of the donor. So it's a way of just sort of avoiding income tax altogether on that $100,000 or $200,000 chunk. And it doesn't have to be $100,000. It could be $20,000 or $75,000 or anywhere in that range. So I urge people to know about that and to keep that in mind. Also, because of the 100% deductibility limitation for gifts of cash that are made in the calendar 2020, another possibility is for those people who have attained the age of 59 and a half, and as such are old enough to begin taking distributions from their IRA, those individuals might be encouraged to take a distribution that they weren't otherwise planning to take in order to then turn around and gift it immediately to your organization. So there are really two different ways that the donors, depending on where they are in their age brackets, could tap into their IRAs as a source of giving. And I think because the stock market has actually recovered from the lows that it was experiencing in March, that this is a particularly good time to be asking people to do things like that. Of course, there's no way to know exactly how long the stock market will stay where it is right now. A second technique I want to mention is the use of charitable gift annuity programs. Many of your institutions have existing charitable gift annuity programs. These are arrangements between a donor and your institution in which the donor and possibly the donor's spouse retain a right to receive a fixed stream of payments, usually for life. This is often very appealing to donors because it gives them the assurance that the university will continue paying them, the college or the university will continue paying them a reliable stream of money for as long as they're alive. And of course, whatever is left over goes to the institution as a permanent form of charitable gift. And sometimes it is possible to fund charitable gift annuities with works of art, although there are deductibility limitations that would apply if a donor did that. More commonly, charitable gift annuities are funded with gifts of cash, or better yet, appreciated securities. One of the benefits of funding a charitable gift annuity with highly appreciated securities is that rather than having a big capital gains tax bill at the time that the transaction is entered into, the realization of the capital gains is spread out over a period of time, and a portion of each payment back to the donor is treated as a return of capital gain over a period of the donor's lifetime or life expectancy. The consequence of that is that those annuity payments will consist in part of capital gain and in part of taxable income that will be taxed at a slightly higher rate than capital gain. But the larger the portion that's taxable as capital gain, the better. And some of the payment returned to the donor will actually be tax-free because it will be deemed to be a return of the donor's investment in the appreciated assets in the first place. So charitable gift annuities are very much worth exploring with donors in consultation, I think, with the institutional development department to make sure they're being described appropriately and that the institution is set up to provide charitable gift annuities. And finally, the charitable remainder trust. As I said earlier, we are talking, I was aiming to organize this in terms of things that are available for the most number of donors first. And I would say that a charitable remainder trust is probably the one that's available as a serious option for the smallest number of donors, but sometimes for the donors that have the greatest possibility to make a really substantial gift. A charitable remainder trust is also a vehicle that allows the donor and possibly the donor's spouse to receive back a stream of payments for a lifetime. For donors who are feeling a certain insecurity about the future and want to make sure that they have adequate income into old age, the charitable gift and the charitable remainder trust can be an appealing option because then they have a fairly high assurance they will continue to receive a stream of income. So I think it's definitely a technique worth discussing with higher end donors who have appreciated assets. The technique is most tax efficient. It achieves the most tax leverage for the donor if the assets that are put into the charitable remainder trust are have already appreciated substantially from what they were, the amount that they were purchased for. It also works best with gifts of securities, and it can work with gifts of real estate or even gifts of art, although the rules become somewhat more complicated and the deductibility picture can be less favorable. So those are the three techniques: the IRA rollover, the charitable gift annuity, and the charitable remainder trust. Finally, I will say that because most of your institutions are actually part of a larger institution, that is, the university is really the corporate entity and the museum is really a division of the university, everything you do will probably need to be working with the institutional development office in some appropriate way. And ideally, you will figure out ways so that whatever money is directed your way comes in the form of a restricted gift so that it is restricted to the museum. There can sometimes be a tussle in an institution over the issue of where the money goes ultimately. So another weapon in the arsenal of anybody trying to raise money for a college or university, museum or gallery is to argue for the donor to restrict the money so that it's always limited to the museum and the museum's purposes and can't be siphoned off for something else. And with that, I will end my remarks, and I believe I'm turning it over to Natalie now. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you. And thanks to all four of you. We are getting a few questions in the Q&A, and Christina and I are going to make some selections from those. And we have some questions that we actually would like to pose as well. But I want to just remind our four presenters that you may have questions of each other, and we would gain a great deal from that interaction and learning from your exchange. Christina, do you want to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you all so much for your presentations. The first question is, what do you see as the distinction, and this is sort of for anyone, although primarily Miriam, what is the distinction between reopening and the idea of reemerging? So some of our academic institutions have been somewhat dormant. Students haven't been on campus. And so I think that's what it's referring to. So do you see reopening and reemerging as synonymous, or do you see it as conveying different phases or phenomenon, and how are donors responding to institutions being closed?
I think, so I think reopening is kind of the first piece of the reemergence, right? Because I think that if you are reopening, you're likely reopening in limited capacity, both within the museum or gallery, and also possibly on the university side, that there's not a full presence on campus. So I think reemergence is kind of whatever the back to normal is going to be. But that said, we have to kind of think creatively as we are reopening more about what are some of the opportunities that we have to position ourselves to our donors, to our audiences, and think about this moment in different strategies to employ. And how do we kind of shape the narrative? Because upon reopening and then reemergence, we know we're going to need a runway of funding. And so how do we position that? How do we work with some of our advisory boards and our community members to kind of think about what is needed and how we secure that?
Great, thank you. Also, Miriam, you had mentioned this, and Martin, you had as well, about making your white paper and your slides available. So maybe that's something that we can coordinate with Jen at the end, and then everyone who's on the call, we can put those out through the listserv, and certainly we can make that available to you. So thanks for those questions.
So we encourage you to type your questions in the Q&A. We're looking forward to hearing from you. You know, I have a quick question. Maybe it's not so quick for Martin. You recently wrote in, I think it was the art newspaper, about the Baltimore Museum of Art's deaccessioning.
Yes.
And their redistribution of funds from the deaccession to create an endowment. I think it was Endowment for the Future or of the Future.
Mm-hmm.
And you were critical of that. And I'd like you to kind of share a little bit about that approach to.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a topic of great interest
to
institutions currently. And, you know, obviously, I am generally a big advocate for deaccessions if it's done thoughtfully and primarily based on clear and coherent curatorial objectives. My impression from working with institutions is that anywhere between 10 and 20% of material and storage is probably, potentially out of focus or in the wrong place. And any kind of systematic approach to addressing that, although in many cases it can be fairly low value and time consuming to handle. In the particular case of Baltimore, my primary concern is that at least the rationales that were offered for why these three particular works of art were being deaccessioned did not seem to have a cogent curatorial explanation. It seemed like they were identified for their high market value. But it's just to be specific, and I've written additional commentary in an exchange with the curators there, is simply two things. One, I felt like irrespective of their very, laudable goals in trying to, restitute inequality and make themselves a more civic museum for their community, is it necessarily the case that these three paintings or works of art need to be sold to achieve that, but also that there was somewhat of a rush to the process? This was announced at the beginning of October. Those works, two of those works will be sold next week. Really was a very little opportunity to explore it. And one thing I would just say, since it was a museum call, is one of the things that we have always promoted when we speak with museums that are exploring a deaccession is try to see it, if possible, especially if it's a major work that could be construed of interest to other institutions. Is there an opportunity to find another museum that could acquire it at a close approximation to fair market value before, rushing headlong into auction? I know that sounds unlikely. I mean, these are very valuable paintings, but our firm has in fact recently facilitated the intramural transfer of paintings, in the $7 million range, the $10 million range between one museum and another. And it may not be possible in the case of the Bryce Martin or the Andy Warhol or the Clifford Still, but I feel that is sort of the first step one should take before going to auction. And then secondly, in this particular case, you really need to take into account the donor's intent, at least in some fashion, in your considerations of the next step. Mr. Still, gave this painting to the museum, one of very few pieces that he gave to institutions. And I think more consideration of his wishes should be taken into account, as well as the efforts of their former curators to acquire the Warhol and the Martin. And specifically because, especially in Martin's case, where you have living artists, dealers try to place, key works at museums, not only because it underscores their canonical status, but because museums almost never sell them, right? And that is sort of a kind of a contract, social contract we make. So if we start to do that with cases where there's a lot of appreciation, it could overturn that very important alchemy that museums are receiving donations of very important new upcoming artists if their dealers or they themselves are concerned that they might be sold at some future date because they've had a lot of market appreciation. For that particular reason, I think the particular case of Baltimore's decisions seem perhaps a little hasty, let's say. And again, I welcome these conversations. I think that we all have to have a dialogue. And one of the chief problems, I think, in these cases is museums often adopt a kind of cult of infallibility, like they've made a decision and they can't possibly change their mind. And I think that often what happens is you open the conversation to more voices, you might have to reevaluate the reasons and the rationales you offered before. And I would encourage all museums to be more open, as we've said earlier, and transparent and accept the possibility of other alternatives rather than rushing to a final decision. So it's a lot to say, but that's basically where I am on that case.
And part of that had to do with the fact, really was the AAMG relaxing the standards or ethics for deaccessioning and the use of deaccessioning proceeds.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the case. The problem there, I think, is that they were trying to be very careful and they didn't want to define what direct care means. But of course, that opens a whole floodgate of anyone can define it as they wish. And it's sort of that same kind of oracular, vagueness about what the right protocol is. Obviously, AAMG is very concerned about this kind of outcome, but I think that they need to be more specific about what they're proposing and how it stays within their ethical objectives, in my view.
Well, and I think AAMD really wanted to put that out there for museums that were in distress, to help museums that were in distress. And the Baltimore Museum of Art said quite clearly, they're not in distress. And so AAMD was clear in its intention in that also and that was done very early on in the pandemic also to help people out. And I think to help mid-size and smaller museums have a way to stay within the parameters, but yet survive. It was about survival to a different end. John, sorry I spoke over you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, and I would add that before any museum decided to embark on such a course, that it might be advisable to speak with AAMD. I can't speak for AAMD, but my sense is that the intention there was to grant a limited window of opportunity, April 2020 through April of 2021, some date certain in April, when there was the opportunity to use deaccession proceeds for something other than buying more art. There was not the intention, as I understand it, to create anything that could go on kind of forever. And I think that direct care is a, you could define it, I guess, pretty loosely if you wanted to. I'm not sure that the AAMD would agree with you. So I think it's certainly something where a museum should proceed with caution. Secondly, we always talk about how extraordinary a moment in time is. And yet, if you look back on your life, by the time you've reached a certain age, you're like, well, gee, gosh, 9/11 was pretty extraordinary. And gee, gosh, the stock market crash of 2008 was pretty extraordinary. And gosh, what about 1987? I mean, we keep sort of like seeing these things and and that's just in the span of my professional life, and I was not practicing during the oil embargo, but there are always those moments. Yeah. And these rules came about in the context of the early 70s and some of the things that were going on in the American economy at that point. So I think we shouldn't be too quick to just sort of leap into an exception and start using it as the new way we do things. And I think there'll be a backlash if we do that. And the point I wanted to make about something Martin said, which I agree with, is that the accounting profession has something to say about this too, which is if museums treat their art assets like financial assets, we may see the accounting profession, FASB as it's called, come forward and say, well, museums who behave that way can no longer exclude their art from their balance sheet because they're basically treating their art like a financial asset. Mm-hmm. And finally, for those of you who were not around in 2008, be sure to read up on the Brandeis Museum and the Rose Museum at Brandeis and some of the controversies surrounding that. I think there were a lot of controversies. That was probably the biggest one in that period. So
one of the compounding ironies, of course, is that Mr. Bedford, who's the director now at Baltimore, was the subsequent director at the Rose Museum at Brandeis after they pulled back from that step, and was somewhat celebrated for protecting the institution against this massive deaccession. So there's very interesting compounding ironies in the particular case today. And as I said, I fully support the mission that the curators have espoused. It's just, is there no alternative way to get there? And that everything should be taken, there's a lot of, not to belabor on the deaccession point, there's a very large number of similarities here with the Berkshire Museum case. A rush to deaccession, a huge endowment in play. It's not entirely clear that it's justified, the selling of a work that was gifted by a major artist. I mean, I think that, what's odd to me is that case generated pretty universal condemnation by the museum professional community. And I think everyone starts trying to scratch their heads right now as to what are the new standards and how have they changed.
This is a great conversation. I feel like we need to have a separate panel just to discuss deaccessioning. But John, you brought up some excellent points, all of these various crises that have reverberated, certainly during my lifetime. And I'm wondering if, you're seeing among donors, and this is a question for all of you, if you're seeing among donors an urgency to take advantage of some of these windows, or whether or not you're seeing people really hesitant given the uncertainty of the political climate that we're in. Are people thinking that they may not have multi-year gifts, but would like to take advantage of the CARES Act donation deductions now? Just what's your sense in terms of how people are handling this particular moment basically 2 months before the end of the year?
I would say that it really, a lot of it depends on how wealthy the donor is. The wealthiest people will be wealthy when this is over, kind of no matter what. And so what I've seen are some very wealthy people sort of question some of the assumptions of gifts that they were planning before COVID happened. And whether that particular thing that they were going to fund, say a building project or something, is really where they want to focus. They may be saying now, well, gee, is there some other area in the life of museums that I should be focusing on? So I don't think it's taken away their interest in museum or the wealth that allows them to support museums. I do think it's causing some of them to question what it is they want to fund specifically.
I would agree with that. I think people are shifting, the idea of building the new wing, building the new building, priorities in museums are shifting. And I want to go back to that reopening, reemerging question, because museums are grappling with purpose and what our purpose is going to be. And there was just some data released that Arthur Cohen collected from 120,000 people were surveyed about what should a museum's purpose be. And it's what people's ideas of what museums are is truly shifting. And we have to grapple through this time. It's a time of change. So they want to see things that are relevant to themselves, relevant to who they are. They want you to be able to go to a museum and find a way to make meaning of the world around them. So it's shifted from that aesthetic, escapist, experience the work of art, and it's coming into a more, and Lonnie Bunch talks about it, a more civic engagement. And so we're seeing donors, and part of why I talked about DEI is they're shifting their focus on what they'd like to support within the museum itself that they love,
Right.
the institution that they're connected to.
And I think this was like part of a change in the zeitgeist that was underway anyway. I mean,
Yes.
like if you looked at like what wealthy people were looking at funding, wealthy people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, as opposed to the prior generation, they were interested in issues involving, inclusion, social equity, all those kinds of things. That's what they were interested in. And often cultural institutions were, fifth on their list of things they were interested in funding anyway. So this is really just, I think, broadened the sense that you fund museums for something else. So it's really just another step in a process.
I also think in terms of making the case, gone are the days where it's support us because of we are this institution, right? It's really about what are our priorities, and we don't want to chase the funding, but what are our priorities, especially in this moment as we're thinking about our future as institutions, how we're reshaping what our connection is to the community, how we define community, how we define impact, how we define our relationship, and then really working with the donors essentially to find that mission alignment between what their interests are and what it is that we're doing, and really diving deeply in that.
So,
Along
go
those
ahead,
lines-
Natalie.
I'm sorry. I was just wondering, kind of, what are the shifts or the trends specifically that you're seeing as institutions kind of have to recalibrate to the new reality in the middle of a campaign? So what strategies or what kind of changes are you taking note of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to what John said, the people who have significant resources are going to continue to have significant resources. What we found in this moment is the leadership piece is critical. So the leadership of the institution, people want to continue to support, and by and large, donors get involved with an institution because of the leadership, because of the vision, because of the direction something's going in. So in this moment, when frankly nobody has a playbook, people are willing to kind of work with those leaders, and the relationship between leaders and advisory boards is really shifting. There's a breaking down of walls. We're all in each other's homes these days, and there's a really nice dialogue and kind of paring back the layers of the onion to get to the reality, to get to what is our vision for the institution, and what is it that we actually need to get there? And that becomes a depth of relationship between the donor and the institution that just is different than what we were seeing kind of by and large before. And so that's very encouraging. I think the other thing just to note, certainly we know about the resources that have been given, in March and April, it was to direct services and to the CDC and to all these organizations that were directly tied. You know, there was also investment in terms of food banks when there was food insecurity all of a sudden with the growing unemployment rates. And then with George Floyd's murder, it was a shift into more racial justice organizations, that sort of thing. So it's really amazing kind of the money and certainly to the political environment as well, that even despite the high unemployment, people are really stretching, I think, in a way philanthropically that they haven't before. And so it's about really finding that mission alignment and building those personal relationships to get you to a different point.
So, Natalie, there's one question in the Q&A, and then that's probably about the time that we would have. This will be the last question, I think. I think we've all seen the power of small donors that they're able to make. And this person asks, I'm really intrigued by the 300 level of donating as a write-off that many of us don't likely know about or understand. And I'm really interested in attracting younger individuals who might be able to make this kind of a gift. Do you have any suggestions for messaging and getting the word out about this opportunity as an enticement for young potential donors?
Well, so the $300, has to be a cash donation, and it's an above the line write-off that is part of the 2020 CARES Act. So it ends in December. And I think a lot of folks, I mean, I have found even very, very high net worth individuals aren't aware of some of these things that are going on with the CARES Act. And so messaging out to people about that and how it works for them at the $300 level can be an enticement and an enticement to some younger folks as well. Because you've got plenty of young people who are still employed and do have income that they're willing to part with in that way.
And I would say that a lot of people historically have been confused about the charitable deduction in a lot of ways. And one of them is that many donors just don't understand about the impact of the itemized deductions. You know, people will say to me, is it deductible? And, you know, the answer is always, well, it depends on your personal situation. And you know, and sometimes you say, well, you're a graduate student. It's unlikely you have enough deductions, enough income. You can actually use this as a deduction. But I think one way to sort of express it to people is to do the math for them and say that because it's deductible, it's really only going to cost you $180 to give $300 or whatever. You have to do the math about like what it kind of is worth on an after-tax basis, or what it costs, I should say, on an after-tax basis. I find even with wealthy people that that when you do that math and you tell them like it's really only going to cost you about half of what it looks like it's costing you to make that gift, they like that idea a lot. So maybe phrasing it that way.
Yeah.
These are all great comments and great ideas for us and for our members. And I really want to thank you all for taking the time and preparing for today's webinar. Christina, do you have any closing words?
No, I just want to thank you all for this conversation, the ideas. I think we'll be looking forward to the white paper as well as the slide deck. And it may well be that people reach out to you individually. So I'm sure that there are a lot of people that have further questions than what we're able to accommodate today. But thank you very much.
And just one more closing comment. I just want to thank the Kress Foundation for their financial support to make this program and 2 forthcoming webinar programs in November and December possible. So thank you to the Kress. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.